2026年1月23号，越南共产党第14次全国代表大会上，领导人苏林以全票连任越共总书记。
nước Cộng hòa xã hội chủ nghĩa Việt Nam muôn năm。
这次大会过后，苏林进一步巩固权力，甚至有可能兼任国家主席，在越南政坛真正实现定于一尊。
Vietnamese leaders want to have a man who is more ambitious with plans.
So he's possibly going to link it. But even if he did, it doesn't all of a sudden make him a dictator.
这位公安出身、喊出改革与发展目标的总书记，正试图带领越南完成10%经济增长的艰难任务。越南接下来会迎接新一轮腾飞，还是走向一场缺乏制衡的高风险豪赌？跟随世界大解说，一起走进越共14大这个或许会被写进历史的转折时刻。
Đại hội đại biểu toàn quốc lần thứ 14 của Đảng Cộng sản Việt Nam là sự kiện chính trị đặc biệt trọng đại của toàn Đảng, toàn dân, toàn quân ta。
越共党代会，全称越南共产党全国代表大会，是越南共产党的最高权力机关。除了战争年代开会时间不太固定以外，从1976年开始，基本按照每5年一开，雷打不动。这次召开的就是第14届党代会。大会由全国选拔出来的党员代表参加，主要处理这几件事：一是讨论通过一系列报告与决议，盘点过去的成绩和问题，同时给下来的发展定调。另外，大会也要选出新一届越共领导班子，包括中央委员会，再从中选出更核心的中央政治局以及全党的一把手越共总书记。可以说，在越南一党制的体制下，党代会一向是外界观察越南政治动向的风向标。这次的14大更被不少人看作是10多年来最具决定性的一次大会，其中一大看点就是越共高层的人事变动。1月22号，大会代表选举产生了包括180名中央委员和20名候补委员在内的第14届越共中央委员会。1天后，新一届党中央召开第一次全体会议，也就是所谓的一中全会，从中选出由19人组成的核心领导机构14届中央政治局，还全票通过苏林继续担任总书记。而现任越南国家主席梁强跟总理范明正则双双落选新一届中央委员会，自然也从政治局班子里出局。根据越南的政治惯例，这意味着他们将在下届政府换届时卸任。舆论难免开始揣测，这样的变动是不是高层政治斗争的结果？
Vietnam has a rule. You can't be over 65 if you're in the Politburo to be put on it or be re-elected. Pham Minh Chinh is 68 and Lương Khương is 69. And so they're not on the Politburo and they're not on the Central Committee. So those two people retiring, because you cannot hold one of the 4 pillars unless you are on the Politburo. And it's highly unlikely to even have a minister who's not on the party central committee.
或许范明正和梁强的落选的确是在遵守政治局委员65岁上限的不成文规矩，不过这个所谓的规矩并非不能打破，因为在新选出的政治局里就保留了一位50后的老同志，那就是今年69岁的越共总书记苏林。
Tô Lâm, Tổng Bí thư Ban chấp hành Trung ương Đảng khóa 13, tái giữ chức Tổng Bí thư Ban chấp hành Trung ương Đảng khóa 14。
苏林1957年出生，从1979年加入公安系统开始，已经在越南体制内服务了将近50年。他长期扎根公安部门，一步步从基层做到公安部长。2016年，越共前总书记阮富仲开展了轰轰烈烈的反腐运动，苏林掌舵的公安系统成为反腐生力军，他本人也成了阮富仲的左膀右臂，跻身越共中央政治局，位列党的领导中枢。再后来，反腐烈火越烧越旺，连续2任越南国家主席落马，苏林则在党内竞选中胜出。2024年升任国家主席，并且在阮富仲因病逝世后再次突围，接棒成为新任总书记。 按理说，苏林已经到了退居二线、颐养天年的年纪，可他非但没退，反而有不少分析认为，苏林很有可能更进一步打破越南最高领导层一直以来由总书记、国家主席、总理跟国会议长组成的4驾马车格局，由自己兼任国家主席，实现党和国家领导人的2位一体，真正意义上在越南政坛做到定于一尊。
I expect that To Lâm will be the president and the party chief after the National Assembly elections in March. It's not that Vietnam will abandon the collective leadership arrangement, but because that in the next phase of development, Vietnamese leaders want to have a man who is more ambitious with plan and who will be taking responsibility for all of those reform initiatives. But at the same time, I think the 4-pillar system will remain intact in the way that now we don't have the presidents, but we're going to have a new position, which is the permanent member of the secretariat in the party, basically a vice general secretary, will be promoted to the 4th pillar. Even though we have a nuclear leader, we still have a strong checks and balance by different institutions, so that even though To Lâm is given a strong mandate, he will not abuse the position to benefit himself or to go off the plans at the Congress.
看来，集中权力才能搞发展的共识，是苏林这次能顺利巩固权力、赢得党内支持的关键理由。此时，人们不免好奇，这位大权在握的政治強人，接下來到底想把越南帶向哪里？他的真正抱負又是什麼？
Phấn đấu đạt tốc độ tăng trưởng tổng sản phẩm trong nước GDP bình quân cho giai đoạn 2026-2030 từ 10% trở lên。
越共14大开幕式上，总书记赵立上台发表主旨讲话。这次苏林整场演讲提的最多的就是2个关键词：深化改革、发展经济。他开出了一张非常大胆的支票，承诺在未来5年要把越南的年均经济增速拉到至少10%以上。其实，在苏林接任总书记后不久，他就已经开始大动作。先是一轮大刀阔斧的机构改革，裁撤了接近10万名公务员，还对全国的行政区划动手术，削减合并了将近1半的省级单位。按照他的设想，这些看起来阵痛的调整，都是为了给体制瘦身，给效率提速，让这台国家机器转得更快一点。所以说，苏林在14大抛出的发展愿景并不算突然，只不过10%的增长目标是不是定得太高了些？要知道，哪怕在过去10年，也就是越南经济最风光的一段时间里，他交出的最好成绩也不过8%左右。在全球经济普遍放缓的大环境下，越南真的有把握一路冲到10%吗
？10% growth in GDP every year is challenging for any countries, not just for Vietnam. And if you look at the personnel, if you look at the ambitions, if you look at all of those unrealized potentials that Vietnam have, we obviously have the opportunity to do that. But at the same time, it's very challenging as there would be no room for errors. And I would believe that having this is good in terms of having more motivation to work. But at the same time, if this target becoming politicized in the way that you have to reach the target by any means, and I think that would not be sustainable and good for Vietnam's macroeconomic stability in the long run.
要让10%的增长目标落到实处，而不是停留在口号层面，越南首先得正视现实中的发展瓶颈，其中能源短缺问题尤为突出。近年来，电力供应紧张且稳定性不足的情况屡被提及，随时可能成为拖累经济的绊脚石。
If you look at the expansion of Vietnam manufacturing industry and the increase of FDI investment to Vietnam, we need a lot of electricity. But at the same time, the generation development of energy in Vietnam only grows about 8% per year, while the demand increase nearly double that number, which means that we are coming to an energy crunch very soon if we can't develop a very strong, solid energy infrastructure. Now, Tô Lâm wants to move very quickly on that front, but that takes time. And, I think that infrastructure will be the key bottleneck that the government has to solve before thinking about the double-digit target.
除了能源，苏林在14大报告里还专门点明了私营经济对发展至关重要。要想把越南打造成投资热土，改善营商环境，吸引国内外资本，光是精简机构、提效审批还不够，能不能持续有效地打击腐败，恐怕才是关键一环。
We take Transparency International's Perceptions of Corruption Index. 0 is bad, and 100% is clean. When Nguyen Phu Trong took over, Vietnam was 2.9, really corrupt. Now, when he passed away, Vietnam had just reached around 43, just below the world average for being corrupt. So you have still widespread corruption in Vietnam, but you have an improvement. And that has made the business community even more reassured.
苏林大力推行改革政策，但越共长期遵循集体领导，权力运行并非一人拍板。要把高速发展的目标真正落地，还得看党内政治精英能不能步调一致。越共高层到底能否配合苏林的这套改革路线？从14大之后的新一届政治局班底，也许能看出一点端倪。这届政治局排在苏林之后，位列第2、第3的是现任国会主席陈清敏和中央书记处常务书记陈锦秀。以他们的资历和年龄，这个排序可以说是实至名归。让人眼前一亮的是紧随其后的年轻血液，政治局排名第4的委员，现任越共中央组织部部长黎明星。黎明星1970年出生，留学日本，曾任职亚洲开发银行。2016年，他46岁时就出任越南国家银行行长，是这个机构史上最年轻的一把手。不少观察家认为，黎明星是越共党内懂经济的技术官僚，未来很可能在改革进程中扮演关键角色，也是外界普遍看好的新任总理热门人选。另一个备受关注的政治明星是政治局排名第17位的阮清义，现任中央政策与战略部部长。阮清义出生于1976年，曾赴美国深造，拿到建筑工程博士学位。39岁时，他就出任坚江省委书记，一度是全越南最年轻的省级一把手。不过，要再细看这2位70后政治局委员的背景，却也隐藏着一些派系关联。黎明星的父亲黎明光曾任越南公安部长，是苏林早年的老领导，而阮清义则是前总理阮进勇的长子。阮进勇在任时一度被视为越南政坛里偏向改革、立场也相对亲美的南方派的代表人物。后来在和前总书记阮富仲的权力博弈中，逐渐被边缘化。但在苏林接任总书记之后，阮进勇又开始频频公开露面，还多次与苏林同场出席活动。
I think there would be a very strong coordination between the technocrats, the new technocrats, younger generation, and Tô Lâm security apparatus. So in which we're going to see a very interesting dynamic between economic development and maintaining the regime resilience in Vietnam in the next 5 years.
苏林在14大进一步坐稳位置，越南高层的权力版图算是暂时尘埃落定。他当选总书记当天，中国国家主席习近平第一时间发来贺电，两人还互派特使，延续了中越两党之间一贯的党际外交传统。另一方面，苏林也在加紧和美国打交道，不仅批准特朗普家族企业在越南开发豪华度假村的项目，还即刻响应特朗普的邀请，加入支持加沙重建的和平委员会，并在2月中旬访美，出席了委员会的首次会议。看上去一切都是合作共赢、左右逢源，但在这个越撕越碎、阵营对立越来越明显的世界里，摆在苏林面前的还有一个更难的问题：要怎么在大国博弈的夹缝中，把每一步都踩稳、走对？
If you look at the way that Tô Lâm has conducted his foreign policy in the past 2 years, he traveled to more than 20 countries, which normally the responsibility of the president. I think he wants to be the global face of Vietnam's diplomacy, and he will be responsible for that.
Vietnam's comprehensive partnerships are like the galaxy, and Vietnam's in the middle, and it wants everybody to have equity in Vietnam, political, diplomatic, and everything. Why? Because Vietnam won't side with anybody, won't form alliances with anybody, and it will be an active member of the international community.
高速发展和集中权力或许会成为苏林时代越南的主轴。10年之后，当人们再回头看今天的越共14大，它会被视为越南腾飞的新起点，还是一段需要被认真反思的教训？答案终究还是要由越南人民自己去书写。